So it is that time of year. There is snow outside, you're curled up under a blanket with a warm drink, and you need something cozy to pass the hours. Or maybe you just need something comfortable and engaging to help you unwind and enjoy a bit of escapism between non-negotiable family gatherings. Or maybe you're a student and you've got a nice few weeks off and want to sink your teeth into a game you don't normally have the time to play. Okay, none of that really applies to me, but just go with it here. Regardless of the reason, I strongly associate the late autumn, early winter season with RPGs. I've just often spent that time playing them, I guess. Including two of the games on the list that inspired this video, and if we're counting autumn, I played two of these games in the past 2 months as well. So what better to do than to make a holiday special out of this? Especially since this is going to be doing the number one thing I want to do with this channel. Talk about specific games, what makes them special, and maybe motivate you to play something you hadn't heard of. I even wound up kind of sorting these into categories just by accident. There's 2 indie RPGs that take a scalpel to genre traditions, 2 action RPGs that might stretch things a little, but I just really want to talk about them, and 2 classics from the golden age of RPGs. Oh yeah, and this is mostly going to be Japanese-style RPGs, because that's what I prefer, and mostly more obscure shit, so, don't expect Baldur's Gate 3 to be on here. You don't need me to tell you it's good, there's plenty of other people that can do that better than I can. Also, I haven't played it, so I really can't tell you if it's good or not. Let's start off with something nice and obscure. Cosmic Star Heroine. On the surface, it's a throwback to Phantasy Star, the regular JRPG ones on the Master System and Genesis, not the online ones that started on the Dreamcast. This is a game I've wanted to make a video on for a long time, but it never quite worked out. I used to make even more mediocre and half-assed videos, believe it or not. But now I've got another shot at it, and maybe this time I will finally be able to get the good word out there. By now it's a bit of an older indie game, released back in 2017, which is an era when I don't think we'd quite hit a renaissance in RPGs just yet. It has some rough edges, it's unashamedly indie, and rather than polish, it relies on creativity and a solid core gameplay experience to carry itself. And while I think some titles have since surpassed it, it was at the time one of the best RPGs I'd played, and the combat might still just be some of the best, period. But what I think stands out about it the most is how it takes the JRPG genre, one which many players find to be a bit stale, and rebuilds it into something immediately recognizable but wonderfully refreshing. The first thing it removes is long-term resource management. There's no MP, and your party's health fully recovers after each battle. This may sound terrible and sacrilegious, but hear me out. I love the constant resource management of something like Etrian Odyssey, where every trip into the labyrinth is effectively on a timer set by your finite resources. But in most RPGs, resource management isn't this. In most, it becomes completely unnecessary before long, as you end up with an abundance of restorative items. Healing between fights becomes an annoying extra step more than anything else. And of course, Cosmic Star Heroine doesn't make this change thoughtlessly either. It's not just removing an inconvenience out of some intent to streamline the game with no regards to how it changes the experience. It's adjusting the whole game to accommodate. Because the game uses scripted encounters on the map like Chrono Trigger, and because it knows that the player will start every fight in perfect condition, Cosmic Star Heroine makes every fight matter. There's no filler random encounters that you mash basic attacks to get through, and that only serve to pad out the game. Every fight is a meaningful challenge, and this does so much for the experience. Of course, this all does depend on the difficulty level you select. Personally, I suggest going a little higher than you would normally do, but you can adjust it after starting whenever you like, so just find a difficulty that you find appropriately engaging, though the hardest difficulty can be a bit brutal in the early chapters. Of course, making each encounter more impactful wouldn't help much if combat was mediocre or generic, but thankfully combat is where the game shines. It uses a system of in-combat resource management that I haven't seen before. As mentioned, there's no MP or any sort of traditional cooldowns. Instead, using an ability makes it unavailable, but certain actions, mostly defending for a turn, will restore the unavailable abilities. There's also some weaker skills that function as basic attacks that don't get locked off after using them. And you also have a limited number of skill slots to equip, and other abilities, such as ones from items or your equipped armor, only refresh between battles. So you will end up running up against the need to refresh your abilities in pretty much every fight. When you choose to refresh is an engaging decision. It means losing out on a turn of actions, but going too long without refreshing can leave your party unable to respond to situations, such as if an ally takes a lot of damage, but nobody has a healing skill ready. Further compounding this is the hyper mode system, giving the battle a certain amount of tempo by granting a character basically doubled effect for whatever they do every couple of turns. This is fully predictable and clearly shown on the UI. The frequency of hyper mode is set in stone on a per character basis, so you always know when it's going to happen. And because it's so predictable and regular, it adds a rhythm to combat, not to mention another factor to plan around, but it's also something that you can be kept from fully exploiting by the enemy. Together with the refresh system, there's a fantastic back and forth to the gameplay. The longer you go without refreshing your abilities, the more limited your options become. And because of the massive power boost that Hyper Mode provides, you'll want an offensive ability ready to fire off when it comes up. But maybe you have other priorities that prevent you from refreshing, or prevent you from making the most of Hyper Mode. There's enough complexity to the decision making to keep combat from becoming too repetitive, not to mention this all makes it quite unique. And one last nice little wrinkle is that equipment tends to come with secondary effects. While your weapons and armor do also have raw attack and defense power that does force you to upgrade periodically, this does create a satisfying dynamic. It encourages you to constantly adjust your strategy to make the most of whatever equipment your characters currently have equipped. And sometimes you may wish to forgo raw power to keep equipment with better special abilities around for longer. Maybe this is a small thing and maybe some might find it annoying, but to me, it helps a lot to keep the combat constantly feeling fresh. And it undeniably makes getting new equipment far more interesting than just, oh hey, now my number is bigger. Moving on from combat, another nice little thing about the game is that it is fairly short for its genre. My first cleared save file was only at around 20 hours. So it's a great choice if you want some JRPG goodness, but don't have 80 hours to spend on a game like most of the other titles here will require. That said, the game isn't quite flawless outside of the combat. Writing is a bit too quippy and irony heavy if you're not into that, and what twists there are tend to be either rushed or very predictable. Art style resembles the pseudo-anime look a lot of Western cartoons tried around the mid-aughts, and not all of your characters really get enough development. The game isn't as clean and polished as even many modern indie titles can be, but if you can appreciate the authenticity that comes with these rough edges, this really isn't much of a hurdle. Certainly to me, I never really minded. So while Cosmic Star Heroine is rather unassuming and by far the most indie-feeling game on this list, it shouldn't be overlooked. While all of these games do something to elevate the RPG combat, this may well be the best in that regard. Combined with its brisk pacing, I found myself quickly getting carried away while playing it to get footage. I'm not sure there's a better compliment I can give than that. Moving on to Chained Echoes, this was my November and December JRPG last year. I even hit 100% completion on New Year's Day. Wait, shit, it's already been a year? Damn, time sure does fly, huh? Well, similar to the previous game, Chained Echoes is a seemingly standard 16-bit style JRPG that does a lot of things to freshen up and bring some variety to the genre. And it even puts some similar twist on the typical RPG formula. Your characters have a limited number of slots for abilities, creating diversity in the builds you create for them. You recover after every battle, with enemy encounters being balanced around this fact. There's no attrition, so most fights can be do or die, and both games do the Chrono Trigger thing of battles on the overworld. Heck, they even both have a base that you can recruit NPCs to. If you told me that the devs on this game were fans of Cosmic Star Heroine, I wouldn't at all be surprised. But of course, Chained Echoes is its own game, and I think it pushes the envelope even further when it comes to refreshing the RPG formula. Combat takes a standard, though very solid turn-based system and complicates it with a few additions. There's this gauge up here that lets you become more powerful if managed well, but if you overdo it and push it into the red, then it backfires and you're a lot more vulnerable. And in order to prevent this, you need to either take very specific actions or use a move of the type that's displayed up in the corner. This can add a little bit of luck since the type that lowers the bar is randomly determined, but it does a nice job of fixing a common issue with RPGs, which is how combat often becomes repetitive without additional factors to force you to adapt and choose different options. As for other changes, experience points and leveling up are entirely gone. Instead, you gain these grimoire shards that grant skill points, typically by defeating bosses, though sometimes through other systems. And when you spend these skill points, you get small stat bonuses similar to leveling up. Because of this system, the game minimizes the chances you can ruin your experience by getting over-leveled, while also minimizing the chances of ending up under-leveled and giving you a much more streamlined and engaging solution if you do skip a bunch of grimoire shards and need to catch up later. Tying into that is the reward board system, which fills the role of, the general kill X monsters types of quests and other similar, very basic quests, making them a bit more engaging and streamlined. They're all immediately given to you upon entering the relative area, and because the best rewards are based on how many of these spaces you connect, you're encouraged to think about which ones you go after. It's really satisfying to grab spaces that connect two sections of the board you filled out and in the process gain a huge boost to your chain. And what I think really makes these systems shine is how it focuses the progression on doing new things and discovering stuff. You'll never really do much grinding by repeating the same things over and over. I'd really love to see more games adopt this sort of approach. Adding to the combat experience, each party member also has their own role and unique mechanics. And while you only get 4 on the field at the time, you get another 4 in reserve, each paired with a character on the field who they can switch with, adding to the complexities of planning your lineup and your in-battle strategy. Unfortunately, there are 12 total characters in the game, and the later ones do suffer from late party member syndrome. They're less unique, often filling a role another character already could. They bring new mechanics you have to get used to, and you're probably just used to your strategy and attached to your existing characters by this point. Not helped by the fact that some of the later characters are not very developed. At least the game systems mean you don't have to worry about them coming in underleveled. On top of this, there's also mech battles. Yeah, mech battles. Look, I've got over 100 GBO2 videos clogging up this channel. You all know we appreciate mecha here. And fantasy mecha, if they're done right, are a particularly rare treat. Here, the sky armors are great to look at and provide a nice change of pace. They help navigate certain areas and are often used to fight stronger enemies that you would struggle to defeat on foot. They even twist the mechanics of the game a bit, keeping it recognizable but giving their own unique pace. It's even much more focused around equipment, as mech combat should be, letting you mix and match ranged and melee weapons to determine a sky armor's moveset. Unfortunately, not everything is this excellent. Equipment is rather lacking. While accessories are varied enough, and the class emblem system is actually pretty great, providing options for extending and improving a character's abilities, weapons and armor are as basic as can be, to the point where I honestly wonder if they had bigger plans that they scrapped. It's just stat increases, even explicitly organized into tiers. No rare weapons with special effects or the like. On top of this, there's a system with crystals that can be attached to weapons and armor, but this system ends up punishing you for changing things too frequently, and the vast majority of crystals are just not that good, typically due to being too situational. Abilities like buffing offense and defense based on weapon and armor type, two things that are basically entirely fixed, are just too consistently useful. And because you can only add and remove crystals a limited number of times, you're encouraged to get something consistently useful and stick to it, rather than constantly adapting for every new challenge. Thankfully, while recording footage, I did find that the collection of crystals has been improved from when I first played. Previously, when gathering them, you'd run up to a gathering spot and get a couple of random ones. Now, for each crystal you would get, you're given a list of 3 possible crystals. And then for each of these, you can either choose one of the 3 crystals or just get a bit of cash. Previously, there was a lot of luck required to get good crystals. Meanwhile, the bad ones took up the finite storage space you had. But now, you're 3 times as likely to get something worthwhile and can immediately scrap the bad ones. While I think the system is still not great, it's much easier to use and it no longer feels like it's actively a problem that's making the game worse for being here. Honestly, the rest of the game is so fantastic that it's a little jarring to have such a mediocre system, but here we are and I had to talk about it. On to the last few details. The story would be hard to describe even if I was better at describing stories in games. There's a lot going on here, and that's kind of the charm. Your party is largely motivated by their own desire to do what's right, in a world full of different factions and characters, all with their own goals. It takes a while to piece everything together, and there might be a few loose ends in there, but it is a very well-realized world. If you enjoy complicated JRPG plots, well, Chained Echoes definitely delivers there. Meanwhile, if you enjoy exploring the world in these kinds of RPGs, Chained Echoes might just be unmatched. Every section of the world will have a handful of secrets for you to try and uncover, mini-bosses to fight, reward board tasks to clear. Every area is rich with content, but unlike some games, it never feels like the areas overstay their welcome by trapping you in the same area for 20 hours with excessive amounts of mediocre and vapid side content. Lastly, the music. I am even worse at describing music than I am at describing stories in these games, so I'll just let you hear some of it. Okay, seriously, this last song is so good that I actually bought the soundtrack just for this one. It's also all officially available on YouTube, so I'm sticking a link to that in the description. Give it a listen sometime. So, while it maybe starts off a bit slow, once it gets going, Chained Echoes becomes something absolutely fantastic. If these kinds of RPGs were still as mainstream as they were in the 90s, I think this would be a genre-defining title, one whose ideas and design decisions reverberate throughout the industry for years. Unfortunately, that isn't the case anymore, but it doesn't change the fact that Chained Echoes is a fantastic game. Sadly, by the time the video releases, this game will have just left Game Pass, but it's still more than worth the full price tag. If you can get it on sale, it's an absolute steal. By the way, if I may address one friend of mine specifically, hey Jameis, I saw you have this game in your library but haven't played it. You should fix that. It's amazing. Anyway, now that I'm done surprising him and confusing everyone else, on to our next game. Astlibra Revision. I swear, if this was made by a small or medium studio in the PS1 or PS2 era, this would be a beloved cult classic. You know, one of those games that few people have played, but becomes famous through the sheer love its fans have for it. Thankfully, some of this may still happen. I mean, it's got a good amount of reviews and an overwhelmingly positive reception on Steam, so that's gotta count for something, right? So maybe this game will leave its mark. It's such a labor of love that it absolutely deserves to. Gameplay can be a bit button mashy at times, but there's enough thought to it once your moveset gets fleshed out a bit. Really, most of the depth here is from the RPG mechanics. I spent much of the game adjusting my build on the fly for different encounters, which is thankfully very easy when the game runs smooth and the menus are so responsive. Navigating them never feels like a chore, and it really shows how beneficial it can be for a game to run this smoothly. There's no shortage of RPG systems either. Really, there's an excess of stuff crammed in, and it's kind of part of the fun. Level ups provide stat points to be distributed for fans of old-fashioned RPGs that let you assign your own stats this way. Then there's the growth system, where you progress through nodes to collect stat boosts, spells, and treasure by spending different types of EXP that monsters drop. It serves as a nice balancing measure so that it's a lot less likely you'll screw yourself over by making an unbalanced character. Equipment is where the RPG systems really start to shine, though. Weapons and armor can be mastered to provide various passive abilities, equipped through these skill points, which are themselves either earned from treasure chests or by mastering equipment that doesn't have these passive abilities. Or you can equip a piece of gear you've already mastered to have access to its skill for free. It's pretty similar to the later Final Fantasy Tactics games. While I was playing, I ended up spending most of my time trying to grind for materials or level up my equipment. It can indeed be a little grindy, but it's the rewarding type of grind where the improvements are much more noticeable than just a small increase to a number here and there. Also, the game isn't so overlong that the grinding starts to feel like padding. Lastly, there's the scales, which can turn any items into various passive abilities through a balancing system. The fact that the two sides have to be evenly balanced for best results helps to ensure that every item has to be at least considered for the scales, and it's quite fun to put together a functioning and well-balanced set. There's a lot of RPG systems in this game, and I'm probably leaving one or two things out. Unfortunately, many of them do become less engaging as the game progresses. It's still fun to have them, and it all feels much more like the results of passionately throwing in as many systems as the developer could than anything else. This isn't like so many modern games where RPG systems are just crammed in without any thought or care. But ultimately, this is all harmless, and the equipment system is still quite good. Not to mention, it does become worthwhile to optimize. Many fights can be very challenging if you're not making full use of all the RPG systems and leveling up appropriately. Alright, time to struggle over describing another story I really like. Most of the chapters here are self-contained stories, often very heartfelt and with a hint of tragedy to them. Okay, often more than a hint. Many of them rarely get better than bittersweet. If you're not able to get into these short stories, then the story might feel tedious, but if they do click with you, then, well, it's a great episodic format for the story. Meanwhile, the grander overall narrative is full of mysteries to solve, piled one on top of another, until eventually everything starts to come together at the conclusion. All coming together into one of the best time travel plots I've seen. Though unfortunately the post-game is not great. It does have some cool ideas, but it ends up dragging on and taking too long. It takes the game from a perfectly paced 40 hours to a somewhat tedious 60, and the new progression systems end up being more of a nuisance, being largely based on luck. But overall, Astlibra Revision is great for fans of old-fashioned action RPGs. Honestly, for me, it hits similar notes as the original Phantasy Star Online. It feels absolutely like the kind of game that a serious RPG fan comes up with in daydreams. In fact, while I haven't been able to verify it, I have heard that's basically what the game was. One person's labor of love over more than a decade in order to get that game out of their head and into something that people can actually play. Maybe some of the results are a little messy, but when the passion is this clear, it really doesn't matter to me. Give me a messy passion project over a polished, soulless piece of content any day. If you're not convinced, there's a fantastic demo you can try out. It's a good few hours and should be more than enough time to see if the game is for you. Oh, and if you do play this game, make sure you check out the arena after Chapter 2. I didn't realize it unlocked until several chapters later, and some of the prizes are really useful, even necessary for certain aspects of progression. Oh, and also while I'm in this weird post-conclusion limbo, this reminds me a bit of an early mobile game I played a long time ago. Like, very early Android, well before the current status quo of mobile gacha games set in and the resulting stigma. It was a similar sort of side-scrolling action RPG, though it's nowhere near this good. But now I'm feeling kind of wistful over the fact that I can't remember that game. Ah well, on to the next title. Crosscode. Okay, this is stretching the definition a little. This is a bit more of a Zelda-style action-adventure game with some basic RPG elements like levels and equipment, but fuck it. I want to talk about it, and this is my video. It's got some RPG elements, so if I want to put it in my RPG video, I'm going to. But this game has been getting a lot more attention lately, and I'm glad for that. And I also want to take this opportunity to be a hipster and boast that I was into this game well before it caught on. The first video on my channel was for this game like 7 years ago. They had just added the first major dungeon to early access and were holding a contest. Race to beat the boss and make a video confirming it. The first 10 players to do so had a chance to become an NPC in the game. While I didn't win, I still got in early enough to be entered. So yeah, that's my hipster. I was into this game before most people, bragging out of the way. So what about Crosscode itself? You know, the thing we're actually here to talk about, not just me stroking my own ego. Crosscode has you playing as Leah, an amnesiac girl. You're inside a virtual reality MMO of a sort, and you're told that your actual body is in a coma. Okay, so the VR MMO thing is pretty played out now, but I swear back when this game was first being made, only a few video games and anime had done this. But from here, you're encouraged to play through the game to uncover your memories. And in the process, you uncover more than you bargained for. The game does a great job of juggling Leah's regular life as an MMO player with the deeper story going on. And man, does playing this game make me wish this was a real MMO, even if a lot of the design is still obviously that of a single-player game. Combat is quick and shockingly fluid. You can throw balls as a ranged attack, either rapid fire or a charged shot that can bounce off of walls. You can close in with a sweeping melee combo that's effective against groups of enemies. You can dodge and block to defend against attacks. It's all pretty simple so far, but it controls like a dream. Add in special attacks and elemental modes, and there's plenty here to love. Enemies are varied and force different approaches to take them down. Frankly, this may just be the best combat in any top-down 2D action game I've played. The exploration is also a highlight, as you'd expect from a game with such a heavy Zelda influence. Most screens have a few chests to find, whether it's through finding paths to hop along, solving puzzles, or just checking everywhere. The environments are beautiful and fun to navigate to make you pay attention. And the puzzles make great use of your ball throwing mechanics and later the elemental power-ups. Seriously, I'm impressed how much they managed to do with such a seemingly simple mechanic. And of course, in classic Zelda style, the elemental power-ups are gained midway through the dungeons they reside in, often radically changing how you approach the area after you acquire them. As for the RPG mechanics, the stuff that lets me put it in this video, well, they're a bit simple, but they're satisfying to engage with. Leveling up gives you circuit points to spend in the skill tree, which has plenty of nice, chunky bonuses, as well as unlocking new passive effects and combat arts. Equipment is mostly crafted, putting an emphasis on gathering materials, and most of the time you have the choice of a few options, with different trade-offs in their stats and their passive abilities. These aren't the deepest systems, and you probably won't be making elaborate builds or anything, but they're enough to enable some player expression, so they do still enrich the experience. Ultimately, Crosscode probably has more in common with 2D Zelda than most RPGs, but I mean, hey, the Zelda series has always been RPG adjacent, and it's not like there's many games out there for us 2D Zelda fans. So really, that's my recommendation. If you want a Zelda-like with fantastic combat and puzzles, a fun story and setting, and some added RPG spice, well, this is probably the title on the list for you. Man, I still need to play the DLC. Maybe I'll continue the game I started to get footage for this video and finally do that. Now, let's get a bit retro with Grandia II, specifically the HD re-release. An obscure JRPG trilogy from the tail end of the genre's golden age, the Grandia series is best known for its fantastic combat system, and Grandia II is no exception. Honestly, I should probably be starting at the beginning, but this is the only one I've played. I should really fix that. The base of the combat here is a system similar to the active time battle, or ATB, system of many Final Fantasy titles. Controlled through menus like a turn-based RPG, but with actions determined by a timer. And because this game lets you see the timing of enemy actions, you can respond to them, moving characters out of the way, defending in the nick of time, or using a smash attack or a special ability to interrupt the action before it can be executed. Combat, as a result, can feel like a menu-based action game. I guess that makes it a sort of RTS. But regardless, this dance of interruption, along with the way positioning is used, does a lot to spice up the combat. It even makes defending much more useful than in most RPGs. Defensive actions execute instantly and have a shorter recovery time than attacking does, so well-timed defenses can do a lot to give you a leg up. Also, like a proper action game, animations here are really important. If an enemy and one of your party are up to attack at the same time, it's all down to the animation to determine who hits first and potentially cancels the other's attack. The experienced sword-wielding mercenary Ryudo can often beat enemies to the punch, but the sheltered priestess Elena has much slower attacks that can much more easily be interrupted by enemies. All of this comes together into a wonderfully satisfying system, and makes for some wonderfully engaging and exciting combat. As for other aspects of the game, the character customization does a lot with very little. It reminds me a lot of Final Fantasy VII. Characters are mostly just differentiated by stats and special moves, and most of the customization options can be applied to everyone. A character's list of magic spells are determined by which magic egg you have equipped and how upgraded it is. And accessories can be very impactful, such as increasing the number of hits from a character's normal attack or causing them to automatically dodge and counter enemy normal attacks. These are more than enough to let you significantly shake up a character's build. So while it's maybe not as deep as some RPGs, there's more than enough to play with here. The story follows Ryudo, a geohound, that is to say a mercenary, who gets hired by the church to bodyguard a priestess for a ritual. He's kind of a jerk, but the game makes you immediately understand why. Most people treat him like dirt, so of course he's not going to be particularly nice either. And he even seems to play into stereotypes about his profession at times as a defense mechanism to keep people away. And he's also shown to be kinder than he acts, but never to the face of anyone besides his traveling companion, a talking bird named Sky. But when things go wrong with the escort job, he's pulled along on a larger quest to prevent the resurrection of the dark god Valmar. While the larger plot is mostly a collect the MacGuffin story set against a pretty black and white good versus evil divine conflict, this is really more of a framework for a story that's generally more character focused. And it's mostly pretty excellent with fun and well-developed characters. At least until the end. The last few hours the plot becomes really mediocre and generic, unfortunately, but a disappointing ending isn't enough to ruin the game for me. The story is only one aspect of a game's appeal, so I feel like writing the game off entirely because this one part has a bit of a slump at the end is perhaps a little too demanding of perfection. Also notable is that the game's a bit on the linear side, even by the standard of the genre. You just select locations from a menu on the world map, and you can't ever really backtrack to previous locations unless the story mandates it. But the areas you do explore are generally pretty solid. Dungeons tend to have a decent bit of interactivity and movement to them, really showing off the fact that, hey, look, video games are in 3D now. Okay, maybe that's a bit mean. I don't like to knock on old games for being old. I mean, I put this game on the list, didn't I? I'm trying to get you to play it. Anyway, back on topic. Rarely do these elements become full-fledged puzzles, but it is a nice bit of added spice to the exploration. It keeps it from feeling like you're simply walking down hallways. Of all the games on this list, Grandia II is probably the most classical feeling, from the menus to the character models to the cheesy voice acting. Not terribly surprising given the time it was released. Maybe it's not as revolutionary as titles like Cosmic Star Heroine or Chained Echoes, but that's not what it's trying to be. It's a Japanese RPG at a time when Japanese RPGs were still able to be successful just by being good Japanese RPGs. So it only sought to refine and improve upon the genre, not radically reinvent it. Last up, we have Star Ocean: The Second Story R. Another Golden Age JRPG, Star Ocean is a tiny bit better known than Grandia, simply by virtue of the fact that new games are still coming out. But it's very much a Japanese RPG for serious fans of the genre. In fact, the Star Ocean series was explicitly made to be deeper and more mechanically complex than its contemporaries, and the second story is no exception. Even with R making some changes that make parts of it a bit easier, this is still a game that really wants you to engage with all the systems it has on offer. The star of the show is easily the skill system, of course. The game can be broken wide open if you try, and That is part of the fun. I'm quite convinced the developers want you to break the game wide open. Helping this is the fact that you can adjust the difficulty at any time, so that if you feel you've gotten too strong, you can always make things harder to balance it out. I eventually upped the difficulty to the highest level, and by the very end of things, the game had pretty much perfectly caught up to the lead I had built up. But to dive into things a little, there's many different layers to the skill system. You have the base skills, which generally provide small passives such as stat boosts. Then combinations of these on a character will unlock and improve item creation and specialty skills, which are actively used through the menus and are where a lot of the advantages of these systems come from. And then on top of that, by having certain combinations of IC and specialty skills between your party members, you can unlock super specialties, which, while most of them are a little bit more niche, tend to provide even more dramatically powerful effects. And I really love how these layers build upon each other. Adding in how certain characters have talents for certain skills, and you have a fair bit of planning to do for who gets which skills in order to get the most out of your team. There's also a lot of synergy between IC and specialty skills. It's best to explain. Let's say you want to make a new weapon with the customization skill. You could just buy a weapon, buy the materials, and combine them with customization, and that works just fine. Or, if you really wanted to get the most out of it, you could prepare food with MasterChef to improve your chances of getting something good. You can convert iron to materials with alchemy to affordably have all the materials you need. And then when you get something good, you can duplicate the best results with the replication, all while using tools from Machinist and music from Orchestra to save materials throughout the process. On top of all this, some characters even have special uses for their skills, such as one character whose base weapons are pretty much only available through a unique crafting option in the Machinist skill. Unfortunately, this also seems to be where the remake messed with the balance the most. There's the new challenge missions, which can give you some really absurdly good rewards that let you access crafting materials and other rare items and benefits earlier than you should be able to. It also made all the base skills available from the start instead of being gradually unlocked through the game. This honestly kinda screws up the balance, making it a lot easier to get ahead of the game until the difficulty eventually catches back up to you. That said, it's not the worst because these only really give you the ability to break the game earlier. You still have to put in the effort to make effective use of the systems yourself. As for combat, it's a real-time combat system, though I hesitate to go as far as to call it action combat. It's a bit simple for that. There's not too much focus on positioning or reaction time, and mostly you'll be mashing attacks and skills, opening the menu to use spells and items, and watching as the game blinds you with visual effects. There's still some tactics involved, and there's an evasion function that's useful if you're on the defensive, but overall, despite the flashiness, combat still feels firmly like an RPG, not an action game or even really an action RPG. Fortunately, while it would be nice if it had great action combat, it still works out just fine because the game's RPG systems are so high quality. Showcasing how effective your characters are and occasionally forcing you to adapt are what the game most needed from its combat, and it achieves this. And the real-time combat does also have the benefit that combat tends to blow by quite quickly when you are sufficiently powerful. And in line with this, a really nice inclusion is the retry feature, allowing you to reconfigure your party before retrying a battle immediately. A little bit of convenience that lets the game be a bit more demanding when it wants to. For instance, enemies with paralysis can be really dangerous, and getting wiped out by them could get infuriating. But because you have the ability to equip some accessories to prevent this and immediately retry the battle, it nicely streamlines the process and encourages you to adapt. As for the story, its main strengths are its characters and its world building. Unfortunately, the overall plot is a bit weak, mostly consisting of one overarching goal for each half of the game, and various adventures while you get sidetracked along the way. The second half is especially bad about this, since it gives you the airship equivalent, and then just sets you loose to complete 4 areas without any plot except for a single flashback at the end of each. You could have easily crammed all these flashbacks into a single dungeon. Though the plot does have its moments, such as the transition point between the 2 halves of the game, that was actually really exciting. But most of the time, it'll be the characters themselves and learning about the world that are most interesting. Heck, if anything proves this, most info about the main antagonists is optional side content, rendering it more lore than plot. So, very interesting lore, not very interesting plot. Really, I think the best thing I can say about Star Ocean 2R is this. It made me want to play more Star Ocean games, as well as try other titles by developer Tri-Ace. There's a few RPGs, most notably the Valkyrie Profile series, that I've really wanted to try from them. And since the series was on sale on PSN, I grabbed 1, 3, 4, and 5 for like $30 total. Star Ocean 2 is a really great introduction to the series, although I do also want to play the original version now to see how it compares to the remake. Well, that's it for this video. Man, I haven't even talked about as many games as I'd have liked to. There was that Baton Kaitos HD collection thing earlier this year. I haven't even had the time to buy that, much less play it, but I've wanted to try those games since I read about them in magazines back in the day. Oh, and there's also that Super Mario RPG remake. Fuck, maybe next year I'll do a theme of RPGs specifically from Nintendo consoles. That'd be fun. This year I didn't really have a cohesive theme beyond some of my favorite RPGs, particularly focused on ones that I could readily access on Steam. Yeah, these are all some of my favorites, and recording footage for each and every one of them wound up leading to me getting too absorbed and just playing more for the fun of it. If you want RPGs to play, then I really don't think you can go wrong with anything on this list. And with that, I'm done for 2023. I kinda can't believe the year's over already. It honestly feels like we should still be back in, like, April. It was a pretty rough year for me, if I'm being frank here, but there were at least a few really great games that made it worth it. Tears of the Kingdom made me understand why people loved Breath of the Wild so much. Armored Core 6 might not have been as good as Nexus in my book, but it was absolutely the perfect game to resurrect the series. And then Astlibra and Star Ocean 2 made great RPGs to close out the year with. Plus I've been getting back into Phantasy Star Online. Look forward to that and more in the new year. I have a lot of plans. Retrospectives on Phantasy Star Online titles, some Monster Hunter stuff to go with the anniversary, a series on a console I think doesn't get the love it deserves, and a very special video about the year I learned to love video games all over again. But for now, thank you to everyone who has been watching my videos. I've always thought that doing stuff on YouTube would be neat, but I never really knew what I truly wanted to do that would be distinctly mine. And I never really thought anyone would actually want to watch anything I make. So thank you. Look forward to more videos next year, and who knows what else I might try. But for now, this is Mikhail, signing off for the last time in 2023.